Welcome to the Chief Executive Summit. I'm Mark Thompson, and as you know, in our CEO readiness sessions, I'm delighted to introduce you to the world's best chief executives to talk about how they face wicked change and volatility as a CEO. So I'd love to welcome you to meet people who are really extraordinary. You know, today we're fortunate to have someone very different from that CEO cohort, but has had a front row seat on the most powerful job in the world, the chief executive of the United States. You know, when it comes to the office of the chief executive of the US, I don't think John's thinking is second to none. I mean, you basically have had this incredible role in curating conversations and interpreting and giving insights to, I'm thinking back to even the times when, John, you were leading Face the Nation, and I would watch you be so careful and curating very thoughtful, balanced discussions with some of the most powerful people in the world. So I'd be in my socks getting totally caffeinated, listening to your conversations. And I loved your most recent book. We'll be talking a little bit about that today, The Hardest Job in the World. John, thanks for joining us in this session.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm really looking forward to it. And, you know, my thinking about leadership and CEOs and this whole set of issues has been brightened by my conversations with you over the years. So I'm really delighted to be here.
Well, thank you for doing this. You know, I think about the title of your book, and I realize it's a wonderful provocation because a lot of the people on this program in the past and who are listening to it today will be thinking, wait, what? I've got the hardest job in the world. Compared to whom? I love your quote from Lyndon Johnson about, yeah, you've been working on this a long time. You've been going decades at it, and then you get the job. And as Marshall would say, what got you here won't get you there. Kind of what's your take on that, kind of taking the big seat as opposed to any of the other big jobs people have had?
Well, that's one of the reasons I came to know Marshall, actually, was that when I was made anchor of Face the Nation, somebody suggested his book to me. And so I read it and I tried to apply its lessons to my new job at Face the Nation. I'd never been really in television in that way. I came out of print. So
Right.
with that background, when I was thinking about the presidency, and we can go back and talk about why I started thinking about it this way. But when I was thinking about it as a job, what is the actual job that a president does? How do they get trained for it? What are the attributes they need? And one of the attributes it felt like they needed was exactly that, the self-awareness that what got you here won't get you there. And in the American system, in a particular way, what gets you there, what gets you the job, more and more is your behavior in a campaign. And campaigns have changed a great deal. Most, you know, the big and fundamental change happened in the 60s with television. Then it happened as primaries put people who were the most ideologically powerful in the parties in charge of selecting the party's presidential nominees rather than the back room. And that changed the incentive structure of the ways people behaved in campaigns. And it started to sort campaigns for a certain kind of people with a certain set of attributes. And what I wanted to know is, A, how did those attributes align with the actual job? And were the attributes that were required for the campaign an actual impediment to the job? And one of the ways to know how to make that switch is to even know that you have to make the switch at all. Bob Rubin, the former Secretary of the Treasury, co-chairman of Goldman Sachs, said that when he came to Treasury, he was walking with another, I think it might have been another cabinet secretary, another high-level person in the Clinton team, who said, you know, I expect this will be very much like our time in the private sector. And Rubin said, no, I think our first task is learning how very different this is. And he was talking about just being Secretary of the Treasury, but this applies, of course, more so for the presidency, how very much different this is than what we've done before. And knowing that and putting structures in place that take advantage of that difference will be the real decider in terms of whether we're going to have success. And that's particularly true with presidents because they have to move very quickly to take advantage of what used to be called a honeymoon period. Those don't really even exist anymore, but to the extent they exist at all, it's that first movers moment, you know, in those initial days. So you have to know what kind of a job it is that you're first moving in, or you're going to be heading off into some crazy wrong direction.
Well, when you frame it that way, you came from years going through deep analysis and being an analyst yourself. I think when you first came to CBS, and then before that, as you said, you were in print. Where did you come to know this, or start to believe that this might be the frame of reference that you'd be addressing?
I can tell, I remember the moment exactly. It was in the summer of 2004, right before the Republican convention. And my colleague at the time at Time Magazine, a woman named Nancy Gibbs, who's now at Harvard, we were visiting with George W. Bush at his ranch in Crawford, Texas. And we'd done our interview with him in the lead up to the convention. Time was doing a cover story on Bush and his reelection campaign. And he said, if I was interviewing people about the presidency, I'd ask them how they make decisions. And and that, in a sense, is not that much of a surprise, right? But, when you look at the way we cover campaigns, how much do we talk about the decision-making structures, capacity, and skills of the candidates? Almost never.
Right.
And it also changed my thinking in the sense that we need to think more about what the job entails, what it requires. It's a decision-making job. And that, spidering off from that idea of decision-making is a couple of things. It's not just the decisiveness of the chief executive, but what kind of a team does the chief executive build around him or herself? What are the attributes of those individual members of the team? For example, you'll ask any chief of staff of a functioning presidency, and they will say the most important quality a chief of staff has in a presidency is telling the president no. And so why is that a key attribute of the job? And so all of these secondary questions come out of that first one, and so I started to think, this is in 2004, so basically about 16 years before I ended up writing that book, although I've done iterations over sort of sharpening my thinking in some writing I've done, and also when I was at Face the Nation. But it was this idea of looking at the office as a job, and then sort of reverse engineering it to build a job interview that looks for the attributes among those people who would like to have the position.
And then you could really unleash that insight in the conversations that you were having in real time as you would sit with them. And how did you see that what was kind of the variability in how they manage the query, the provocation, and so forth?
Some loved it. You ask Mitt Romney about how you want to run a presidency, and oh my gosh, you'll be there till breakfast. And when I went to interview Senator Romney for the cover story in The Atlantic that I wrote, that was kind of the beginning of what ended up becoming the book, one of the first things he said was, he said, in a White House, they don't have a chief operating officer. And he said it with this kind of excitement, and as if he was, talking about the sexiest topic imaginable. And
he was being an entrepreneur, right? He was wanting to bring that to the White House.
Absolutely. And he and a guy named Chris Liddell worked on, and Chris has a book coming out in January about managing a White House that is about everything you and I have been talking about. But they wrote a plan with 300 people during the campaign, which had never been done before. They started well before Romney lost, but operating on the principle that if he won, they would have a limited period of time. They would have a set of challenges they would have to meet immediately, and so be prepared. And so they took a team of 300, I think at times it might have grown as much as 400, and wrote up a blueprint of how to manage and operate a White House and how to move quickly in those initial days. And it was a businessman's, just like all the people in your audience would approach a problem like that. And it was extraordinary. The opposite of that was Donald Trump, who basically assumed that you could just kind of wave your hand and things would happen easily. And that's, he was an acute case, but a lot of presidents come into office, and one of the first things they all say was a version of what you said about the Lyndon Johnson quote, who said, being president is like the boy at the Hoochie Coochie show. You pay your dime, and when you get inside, it's not exactly as advertised. They all feel that the job is, they have all this enormous responsibility and very little power. And that's been something all presidents feel. President Trump felt it acutely because he misunderstood the job he was going into. And various different candidates have had, different levels of understanding of what it takes to do the job. George W. Bush had a pretty good one. Barack Obama had a very less organizational one, but highly built around a set of values. And basically he said, which is a lot of the successful president said, which is you need to know why you're doing what you're doing, because everything is going to work against you to push you and pull you, and you need a center that you can always return to when challenges overwhelm you.
That, that sense of center and values, what seems to often surprise the aspiring CEO when she or he gets into office is that they don't own their face anymore. That in their very powerful jobs for which they have prepared assiduously for decades and have been tested with P&L and with performance and execution and even on stage, often there are people who are able to light it up when they need to, and they've been rehearsing to do this job, don't quite realize now that this is so different in terms of having to show up in a way that represents and influences just with their expressions, like an actor or maybe even a news anchor. I don't know.
I'm reminded of a story that Norm Pearlstein told when he was head of Time Inc. When I was there. He came over, I guess, from the Journal. And he said one of the first things he had to learn was that if he ordered Mexican for lunch, if he ordered a taco for lunch, that somebody didn't receive the signal that they wanted him, that they should do a cover story on Mexico. Like he learned that, he would send signals that he didn't even know he was sending. And that his role at the top was being overinterpreted, a simple lunch order. Of course, he was being facetious, but that sense that you are sending signals you don't even know you're sending, and also in some instances that the signal you think you're sending is not being received because for one reason or another. You're using the wrong channel. And that has been, obviously in the presidential context, the way it happens is that they, about 6 months into every presidency, there's always a meeting where the president gets his communications team around him and says, the real challenge for us is that we just need to communicate better. And presidents can't actually do very much to change, even though my entire business exists to pretend that presidents have this huge influence over public opinion. There's no evidence. The political scientists have studied this. Even the great communicators cannot completely change public opinion. They can shape and guide, and this is undoubtedly true for leaders in business as well, although business has a lot more power and levers than a president does, but they can shape the flow. They can guide the flow, but they cannot redirect the flow. Now in business, you have much more power, so you could do that, but you still have to answer to boards of directors and shareholders and things, and so you can't rule by fiat. But that idea of communicating and learning what works and what doesn't has been a fascinating part of the presidency to follow, because the methods of communication have changed so much over the last 40 years.
It's such a profound insight, John, because the pushback that I always inevitably get when I say you have to be careful how you look and sound, your intonation on that analyst call in the quarter could throw the market cap off by billions. It's just, it's your 10x version of the financial impacts and also employee empowerment impacts. And then they'll inevitably tell me, it's like, if only they'd still actually do what we talked about doing in the meeting, though. Why is it that you say I have so much profound power in the wrong direction, not with the things I want to get done? What would be your observations there? Because you've seen probably many of these in an intimate way somehow when you talk to these presidents about trying to actually get stuff done. Part of the decision-making process, certainly, but execution is so key for these people.
Well, when Truman watched Eisenhower come into office, he said, and I don't have the quote right in front of me, but he said, poor Ike, he's used to the military and he's going to say, charge up the hill, and nobody's going to charge. And George Shultz, coming from the private sector, said the same thing. He said, you know, in the private sector, you could say, get this done, and people would go get it done. And he said, you get into an administration and you say, get it done, and nothing happens. You know, and this is one of the key challenges of any presidency, and just really understanding your relationship as a president and the people you pick, and how they interact with the permanent bureaucracy. And I don't use that term as a pejorative, but it's a
It's
really
systemic.
Understanding the people who are in the permanent expertise class in government, and how you bring your team on top of that. I mean, it's an enormous merger and acquisition, essentially. And
Yes.
and unlike a merger and acquisition where you'd have years to prepare and lots of lawyers and staff who are expert in transitions, we really don't have experts in transitions. There's a group of people who are becoming that, and there's something called the Partnership for Public Service, which has done amazing work trying to build capacity based on what works in the private sector, and infuse that into the public sector. And they really have done great work, but there's still much work to be done. And the biggest challenge, I think, for any president is, first of all, is team building, because again, what got you here won't get you there. You need people who are not necessarily skilled at campaigns. You need people who can execute in a very different way than in a campaign. It's a binary choice, me or the other guy. And everything you do is sorted into, is this going to help me or the other guy? And that's a very easy decision tree. When you get into office, do I start with healthcare? Do I start with the economy? Do I start with reaching out to this group of people, or do I stay home and work on team building within my administration because I know I have to build that capacity to get anything done? But nobody goes and gets, you know, their poll numbers don't shoot up by 10 points because they did effective team building, right? That's dead work that you know, it's like replacing the windows in your house. Costs you $40,000 and nobody can tell the difference. But of course, it matters when it rains, right? So so that's all of there's all those challenges. And then so it's building a team that it can execute, choosing what to execute in this weird environment where you have a hybrid team. You have your team, which often has to be different than your campaign team, which is really, the Carter administration had an enormous explosion at the beginning because Carter was smart enough to say, I need a different team to execute than to run a campaign. But all the people who ran the campaign said, wait a minute, we worked all this for you on the implicit promise we would get to go to Washington. You can't do this. And so it undid his good efforts. And then I would just finally say the other big challenge, in addition to those understanding how to build capacity, is as Eisenhower said, not letting the urgent overwhelm the important. Understanding what's, you know, if everybody probably knows the Eisenhower quadrant matrix, you have to deal with those things that are important and urgent, but you really have to keep your eye on those things that are not urgent, but are deeply important, because if you don't pay attention to those, they will become urgent soon enough and you won't have prepared for them. And building the space for that and the teamwork that can manage that is a huge challenge for presidents, and in a very awkward environment where everything mitigates against that. Everything insists that you have to deal with what's happening right now, right in front of you, even if what's happening in front of you is kind of frivolous.
You know, the noise is so loud, as you say. It could be frivolous, and yet it's blaring, and it's something that is calling for attention and distraction from the long-term strategy. CEOs feel that all the time. They feel it every day. And probably even in the last few years, it would seem to me, anecdotally, this is your expertise, not mine, that there is an increasing amount of activity now where you'll have a well-meaning chief executive wants to be considerate and thoughtful in responding to a very important social issue or news that affects a huge cohort, maybe sometimes hundreds of thousands of employees and millions of customers. And you know, you could question whether it's in good faith or not, but I know at least the people that I work with were well-intentioned in wanting to be responsive, wanting to be considerate, wanting to be visible in the ways they need to be, and have found that no good deed goes unpunished in that regard, that they become a lightning rod or a platform. What's your advice, or do you even agree?
I agree 100%. And it's a version of the presidential challenge, because you're asked to weigh in on a timeline and with with a certainty that on a lot of issues doesn't exist exactly, and where, especially if you're a CEO, you may not have the skill set for
Right.
managing some of these very sensitive cultural issues. And I think with respect, particularly to the Israel-Hamas war,
Right.
these are issues, and this is a conflict that has been going on, depending on your timeline, for a very, very long time. And um, and there are people who've spent their entire lives trying to get an understanding of it correct. And that's all they've done. So to fulfill an obligation to your employees, which is necessary and perhaps really crucial, but on this kind of issue where you just lack the expertise and also the follow-up ability it's too much. I think one of the things we'll learn from a variety of these moments where CEOs or companies have felt compelled to speak on public issues is that I think essentially there's going to become a view that we can either do what we do or we can engage in public debates, but we can't do both. And that's a bit of a shame, because part of that is because of the social media world we live in and the lack of a grace period that is given in these public debates. Whatever you say immediately gets a verdict stamped on it and gets out of your control. And so that's a shame, because that leads to a bigger problem, which is a lack of a public square in which we can work through some of these complex issues. However, that's the world in which these CEOs work. And I think I don't know how you prepare the ground with your employees to say, I will show up for you and I will be there for you and create the kind of meaning-filled work environment we all want. But that doesn't extend to political issues. So you have to, I guess my point is, you have to find a different way to send that signal without getting, because you're going to get swamped if you try to do it on these big political issues.
Right. That seems to feel like it's a change that we've seen over the years. Have you seen that shift in the velocity of that probably around the social media? Do you think it has to do with the fact that there's more personalized media now, or like less dominance from the curated big professional media? Why do you think that's happening?
I think it's happening probably for a couple of reasons. Yes, the media landscape means all companies, all CEOs have to be aware and know about their company, their image out in the social media world, because their brand can get savaged, and so that's a concern. The second thing I think is where politics is much more with us. People, I mean, and the polls show this, that personal identity is much more wrapped up in politics than it used to be. It used to be a factor in people's lives. Now it is the driver of a lot of people's lives. And social media keeps people on the boil. It keeps people in a kind of fight or flight with their political views. And we've seen, again, from the social science research, that in fact is the psychological response. It touches on the same parts of the psyche that are fight or flight. So we are much more political than we used to be, and we feel it more keenly because of the injections we get from media and from social media. So that means that in my workplace, I now, because of politics is a part of my life, I'm now expecting my workplace to reflect or speak to my deep concern about politics. And then, of course, some of the political issues, whether it's healthcare, childcare, those are overlapping. That's an area where abortion, obviously, in terms of the healthcare question, there is a reason for a company to be involved maybe in that question, whereas conflict in the Middle East there's less of an obvious overlap. So I guess that, and then I think the final point I would make is that we are much more nationalized in our politics. So, the events taking place in an Arizona Senate race can become a national conversation in the way they never used to be in the past. So we're much more political. We feel it more deeply, and there are more chances for us to be in a political moment because our conversation is national and constantly ongoing, and that just bleeds over into the corporate world. And then finally, one last point, they're coming to me as I say them: money. A lot of the CEOs
of course,
are are donating or are asked to donate, and that's a result of the fact that our campaigns are incredibly more expensive than they used to be. But it means that there's an incentive to keep this conversation in the corporate realm, because that's where a lot of the money is, and
Yes.
campaigns need the conversation to be there in order to get the money out of that to then fund the campaign.
Interesting. Yeah, no, that's and you're touching on some other dimension that we've seen in terms of a shift that's going from globalization to regionalization, or the cities as states, or the discussion of the differences and the uniqueness of various parts of America. What would be your observations about that? We're going to be going into a campaign-driven year, and I'm sure the viewpoints that might be universal may not be. There are CEOs now wanting to be very much complementing and engage with the individual, what they might describe as markets for customers and employees regionally.
Tricky. One of the problems with one of the challenges I face when we do our work, and I can imagine this is a challenge for CEOs who have to think about the country and their markets and the different, the red versus blue and all of that.
Right.
I mean, the one thing that I try really hard with my show to do is keep the eye on the ball of what America really is. Don't let the political system and the political conversation sort our country for us. There are a lot of incentives, particularly in the primary season, for the people engaged in the primary to offer up a picture of America that looks very much like the primary electorate, or that is shaped by the concerns of the primary electorate. Well, the primary electorate is not a majority of the parties, and they tend to have more extreme views. They're more involved in politics. And so, but it bleeds into the conversation in such a fashion that because of the shorthanding that happens in my business, which is a flaw of it, it can make it sound like we're talking about in America when we're really, really talking about the concerns of a third of the political party, and sometimes the third of a political party in a state like Iowa, for example, that is not representative of the national demographic shift. We are, and one of the big challenges for America and for its leaders is that America is becoming a demographically different, very different country, which is part of its richness, but also is a challenge to certain regions and certain portions of the country. And the question of the American dream and whether one generation can hand off prosperity and opportunity to the next generation, which has always been the promise, the question of whether that promise exists anymore is tied into, as it always has been in America, but is tied into the demographic changes. So why am I saying all of this? Well, part of it, I could imagine for a CEO, is keeping your eye on what your market is and who your customers are in reality, not as we in the press, and particularly in the political press, might define it. And that, again, goes back to your previous question, which is if my employees are calling on me to make a statement about something, the target they want me to hit is often a target that's been designed by this political narrow conversation. And I'm getting pressure from my employees who I really care about and really want to feel a great way to hit a target that really is neither our market. Well, it's just not our market. And so, wow, I have to think through, I mean, I have two problems. I don't want to bum out my employees, and I don't want to go shooting at a target that is so small that even if I hit it, which these people like, I'm going to blast and ruin and make more complex my normal market for my goods, or a market, whatever, the market of public opinion or whatever. So I think the biggest challenge is just keeping your eye on what really is the American, what your market is or what the American people really are thinking, and don't let the political mess define that, because it's a bad signal to follow, because it's not a clean one.
Well, as you speak, I'm thinking of probably one of the most unfair questions I could possibly ask you, which is to have you just observe, as a lifelong journalist and author and researcher in social science and political science, to make observations about kind of the state of corporate America in terms of what do you think we think about it in terms of an America, or viewers who are watching programs that are thoughtful like yours. So an rather educated audience thinking about American business, and I'll start there actually.
Yeah, it's a great question because, oh, it's such a great question because what do we think about American business? Well, if you were a UAW worker on the picket line, you think American business and the car companies that are part of the heroic American story are, unfairly compensating the CEOs at these extraordinary growth numbers relative to your wages. So you're not that keen on the companies. But then you got an agreement, and these companies have, in some cases, you've had relationships with them through your family for the generations.
Yeah.
And so I guess what I'm saying is I'm trying to think through the different ways. We know that the social contract is under some kind of is under considerable strain in America, and that part of that social contract was between employer and employee. And so to the extent it's under strain, we know that people are working for more companies, they have less connection to a single employer, and those who do have a connection to a single employer sometimes don't feel so great about it. So I think in that sense, I think the corporate America has forces working against its image, because I don't necessarily, in a lot of those cases, I don't fault. It's not the CEOs or the executives who are at fault there necessarily. I think also about corporate America as being defined by its most flamboyant actors. So Elon Musk. I mean, so is corporate, Elon Musk is a hero to many people. And yet, and he's obviously a villain to others. So so in that sense, what is, corporate America? I think it gets defined by the most exaggerated actions of its big stars. Elon Musk is always going to trump Tim Cook, who is a much more quiet, thoughtful steward of an amazing brand who has done an extraordinary thing, which is to take a leadership model and a sense of energy in a company, and then when he has none of the, very few of the attributes that Steve Jobs has, nevertheless is able to take the company and be a massive success with it using a whole different skill set. That is a really interesting American corporate story. Imagine if that affected the way we thought about corporations. It would be different, certainly very different than from what people think of with Elon Musk.
Well, thank you. That last thought ends up being one that I have been proselytizing to not let the exception train the rule in terms of how we prepare people for the job, because they're such rare exceptions. And I'm having an increasing number of, there's been maybe more than 220 CEOs in the Fortune 500 who've turned over in just the last few years. And we're seeing remarkable shifts on board of directors in terms of their representation as well. And the new crop tends to be the ones that are the Tim Cook stewards, who are looking at evidence-based, accountability-based, employee engagement, all those things that don't get much coverage and aren't quite as sexy, but do mean something when you have to come to the office or work for an employer. You were about to say something, though, and to pile on that distinction.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was just thinking we also have the hangover a little, of the 2007, 2009 financial collapse, which I think, to the extent that the public has a broad view of business and the idea that the market led to economic collapse. I think that I think everybody gets thrown in together.
Sure.
But the CEOs, the kinds of CEOs that you and I are talking about, who have this real opportunity to connect with humans who work for them. When you see that in displayed, it's a beautiful thing to see. We should spend more time, and we've tried in our the way that's come in my work is trying to cover these tensions between going back to work or not. The way employers and CEOs have handled that question has touched on a lot of these themes in terms of how people feel about corporations and what their base feeling is as they try to work out those equities.
I would imagine you have a point of view on that now at this point, having prosecuted it plenty. post-pandemic. What would be your view now in terms of what we're looking at in terms of workforce and returning to work? Is it hybrid? Is it
I th- I
everybody
th-
back?
I think it's hybrid. I think for sure. I think people have well, it also depends on how we look at the labor market. People I think it's hybrid. Basically, I mean, I know that's the decision they made at Apple. I know we've benefited from that. Even though I have to be in a physical studio, if you have a few days that are flexible, it's not only helps people live their lives, but it also it allows for a little more expansive thinking. In my case, to have time that you can, sit in your baseball hat rather than being in a coat and tie, to think a little bit more broadly. So my sense is, except with a few exceptions, it's a night it's like a 3-day, 4-day in the office week is where we're headed.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Two last questions, and I appreciate your generous time and letting us hang out with you when you're on a Friday where you can wear your hat and show off the Smith Corona. Is that a manual? Because I had one.
It is. It's an Olympia, actually.
Okay.
And I've collected them for a while, but that one actually works. And so I tried it because my handwriting is not so great. I write my notes on that.
It's a great idea. I've never mastered handwriting either, and I wasn't good at the typewriter, but I'm so glad I get to be able to edit quickly. When you think about we talked about teams as a through line in a lot of this conversation. Final couple of questions. One is around boards. We've seen a massive change in boards, along with a massive shift in the number of CEOs in seat in the Fortune 500. When you think about how the president of the United States might use the equivalent of his board, maybe it's his staff, maybe it's the people who sit in the positions as secretary. What have been some of the observations you've made about how they could be most effective with these powerful subject matter experts who probably have their own share of ego, and getting them lit up?
There is this promise that is there, and it's very hard to execute it. So back to Jimmy Carter, who is a fascinating case study in really having thought through how to reorganize an institution in ways that make really good sense, but that are practically impossible. And one of them was what was called cabinet government. And this was an idea by a guy named Stephen Hess, who was at the Brookings Institution, and was essentially, job is too big. It's just, overwhelming. You've got to cede power to your department heads and your secretaries and let them run with it. Because they are experts, they have buildings full of experts. You got to let them do it, and you then can stick to what you have to manage as a president, which is plenty. The problem is when you go tell the Secretary of Energy to do your energy policy, and your Secretary of Energy bungles the job, all of the downside flows not to the Secretary of Energy, it flows to you. So if you're going to get penalized for it, you move all the decision-making into the White House, because you don't want to have a decision made by somebody out in an agency that you're going to get blamed for. And, one of the things that I really, when I talked to Tim Cook for this book, he said, one of my jobs is to be a heat shield for different parts of the company, which is to say, you take risks, you do your work, you be great. And if something goes wrong, I will stand and take the heat. And it frees your employees up to do their best work. In politics, you got enough stuff that's making things go poorly for you. And so if being a heat shield sounds nice, but if your approval rating is at 30, you're not going to get reelected. So the political demands of which I wish didn't exist, and we see it now. I mean, the press coverage of a presidency measures everything in such fine degree that we lose any larger sense of the picture. So, people blame the president for high egg prices. Well, eggs are expensive because of an avian flu that a president has no power over. Yet the conversation is determined by people feeling horrible about the high price of eggs. It's just disconnected from the actual challenges of the job. So this gets back to this building of the team. How much can you give people their own agency if you're going to get blamed for it in the end. And then the second challenge is there's no real blueprint for how to work with all these agencies. Every presidency has to design it on their own, often with people they're just meeting. You know, in a company, it's like if you were dropped in as CEO and had to perform, you know, immediately on the first day. I mean, there's no ramp up time. And so it's very hard to build an expansive organization because you want stuff to be close because it's the easiest way for you to operate. And it would require an incredibly brave president to come in. And this is what Romney was really trying to do, is to design it beforehand and say, look, we've built a structure, we're going to let it work. And I'll, you know, if I'm a one-term president because I gave my Secretary of Transportation too much power, then fine. But the upside is we could actually get some stuff done that would be transformational. But that requires a mindset to think about long-term that a lot of presidents have trouble doing because they have an entire political staff that is saying, you have to think about the last tweet, you know, that the entire political staff is focused on the nanosecond. And so that really, if one of the challenges we've talked about is trying to not always be stuck with the latest and loudest, you've got a whole team who comes in with the latest and loudest, you know? And so, yeah, the team building function is a really tricky part of the job. And it's made more complicated by the fact that sometimes you're paying off political chits by the various people you put in positions. And so you don't know whether, you know, they're actually any good at the job you're giving them.
That makes sense. When you think about the stress and the pressure and what you've observed in extraordinary circumstances that presidents operate, it's certainly true. We always feel like we're in the most epic time of change whenever we ask ourselves this question. But what would be your advice for managing as an individual leader, the loneliness, the pressure? It's a cliche, right? But it's probably more powerful and profound than ever.
Well, one of the things I've learned from you and being in the company of other people who have had the, you know, high performing jobs is the extent to which they don't have folks they can talk to. And, you know, presidents, it's an even smaller club. Barack Obama said to George W. Bush on the day he was inaugurated, I'd like to be able to call you and talk to you about this job. And George W. Bush said, I'm there for you. I'll always pick up the phone immediately when you call, obviously, but you're going to be so overwhelmed with advice that you're just not going to have the time. And that, in fact, turned out to be true. But, you know, there's only a small, I mean, I would say that the lesson of a presidency is find the people, two things, or maybe three. You've got to talk to the previous presidents just about the job and the mental weirdness, true weirdness of it. I mean, when you go to a foreign country and the hotel you stay in, one time Barack Obama realized that they'd put down sort of sandpaper strips on the floor in the bathroom because the Secret Service was worried he was going to fall and slip on the marble floor. Like, you're treated like a little baby. And so you're the most powerful person in the world and you're a little baby. That's just one little weirdness. It's a constantly weird job. You need somebody to be able to call and say, I have not been able to be alone with my own thoughts for 16 months. Like, how do I? So talk to your predecessors. I think the second is, you know, Barack Obama's mother-in-law lived with him. That was grounding. You know, he had a kitchen cabinet of friends who could kind of bring him back to center, remind him, as all good friends do, who you really are and were at your core. I think that's super important. And then I think we all need this and I certainly know it in the work I do, a strong chief of staff who knows how to get you, how to run you, you know, where your blind spots are, where you're strong, when you need rest, when you, and maybe a few of those. You don't like, because chief of staff has so many of these other jobs that they have to do, but an intentional set of lieutenants who know how to operate you as if you're a machine, you know. And Barack Obama used to talk about this thing called Barack Obama, which was the president that he was and that he knew he was, but he almost had to think of it as another person because you have to think about, how do I deploy this thing called Barack Obama effectively? And I think when you're building your set of lieutenants, you need to have them think, you all need to get together and figure out what the Barack Obama or what this abstract thing is and what it needs to operate most effectively. And that's a psychological as well as kind of operational question. But you need those really strong lieutenants.
You are the brand, and you have to inspire and have a team of people capable of understanding how to play the brand as much as the brand as much as the woman or the man
Right.
in that circumstances. John, I'm so thoughtful in thinking about how you've talked about. It's so thoughtful how you've addressed the issue of presidency and the metaphor with leadership. And I know today people listening and watching this will be inspired by what you're sharing. And thank you also for the latest work and the continuing work that you're doing. You don't have to do this, and you're making a big difference. Having that double click on being considerate in terms of what the issues are, thinking about them in a broader and more balanced way, and shorthanding less and thinking more is something that I would think really characterizes John Dickerson. So thank you for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Oh, that's very sweet, Mark. Thank you. And it's been incredibly useful for me having to come up with these answers. So thank you for your great questions. And thanks everybody out there for listening.